Good afternoon, everybody. I think I'll draw us together. If anybody sitting in the back wants to come forward, we welcome a cozy crowd. I'm Sarah Eberweis-Stein, professor of history and the holder of the Viterbi Endowed Chair, Family Chair in Mediterranean Jewish Studies. And on behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies, I'm very pleased to welcome you to the Al Finci Distinguished Lecture in Jewish Studies. And I'm afraid to say lots of words of welcome because there are layers of poignancy to this event. In a moment, I will introduce you to our two guests to discuss their writing. But before I do that, I would like to just offer some thanks and say a few words about the beloved person after whom this event is named. So I want to say that we have flyers in the back for future events that I invite you to grab and join us for something upcoming. I want to thank all of the staff for all of their work in pulling together this event and invite you to just make sure everything you have that could make noise is quiet, a phone or anything else, a watch, etc. So today's event is under the mantle of the Al Finci Distinguished Lecture in Jewish Studies. And Al was a dear friend of mine and of our center. And I want to take this opportunity to welcome today his wife Rose, also a dear friend and supporter of the community and this series, their son Jeff, who represents siblings Joe and Helen, and also Andrew Viterbi, both brother-in-law of Al, a dear friend, supporter of our center, and responsible for the endowed chair that I hold. We regret that Alan and Karen Viterbi could not join us today, but they are with us in spirit. Two guests with us today for the second annual Al Finci Lecture. And it's really a pleasure to welcome them, especially because we had to wait, I think, through at least one postponement to gather together here at UCLA. Elizabeth Graver and Michael Frank will be discussing with me their writing and what drew them to Sephardic stories, and I will introduce them each in turn. Elizabeth Graver's fifth novel is the one that we are gathered to discuss today, Kantika, published by Metropolitan Books, Holt in 2023. A dazzling multi-generational saga that moves from Istanbul to Barcelona, Havana, and New York, and exploring themes of displacement, endurance, family, and home. Inspired by the life story of Elizabeth's grandmother, Rebecca, Kantika won a National Jewish Book Award for Sephardic Culture, an Association of Jewish Libraries Fiction Award, and the Edward Lewis Wallant Award for Jewish Fiction. Elizabeth teaches at Boston College. And we are also here to celebrate and discuss Michael Frank's 100 Saturdays, Stella Levi and the Search for a Lost World, published by Avid Reader Press in 2022, a book which tells the remarkable story of the now 100-year-old Stella Levi, whose conversations with the author over the course of 6 years bring to life the vibrant world of Sephardic Jewish Rhodes, the deportation to Auschwitz that extinguished 90% of her community, and the resilience and wisdom of the woman who lived to tell the tale. Named one of the 10 best books of the year by the Wall Street Journal, 100 Saturdays won National Jewish Book Awards in the categories of Holocaust memory and Sephardic culture, as well as the Jewish Book Council's Natan Notable Book Award and the Sophie Brody Medal for outstanding achievement in Jewish literature. So we are honored to gather with them, and I will be carrying on an onstage conversation with them for as long as the spirit moves us, and then we will turn to open it up for questions and conversation, and there will be books to purchase and have signed after the event. So welcome.
Okay.
Well, good to have you here.
Thank you for having us.
I thought it would be nice after that long purple introduction to have your voices and the voices of your books come through. So I wonder if we might not begin by having each of you read a bit, and perhaps before you read, set the stage for the reading that you are about to offer us. Elizabeth, would you be willing to go first?
Sure.
I kept them squirming in the dark and chose some selections for them to read such that this would not feel too prescripted. So I invited you to begin with your chapter 2.
Sure, and let's just, can everybody hear me back there? Is this fine? Should I talk more into the mic? Yeah? Okay. So let me just briefly, interestingly, I really haven't read this much, so this will be fun, but I'll just orient you a little bit. So as Sarah briefly said, this novel was inspired by the life of my grandmother Rebecca. She was born in Istanbul in we think around 1903. She wasn't totally clear about it because of the both because she sort of hid dates and because of the Jewish calendar. But she I knew in real life, and this has been translated into the novel, that my great grandfather had been married before. It was his second marriage, and that there was a woman who he had left. He divorced. She was unable to have children. She was, they would say, loca in Ladino or Spanish. She was mentally ill, I think. And that he had gone off to England for 10 years in order to divorce her. And all I really knew about her was that my grandmother felt very guilty because this woman would sit in the window of her apartment. They lived in the same small neighborhood of Fener Balat, or Balat Fener in Istanbul, and call down to my grandmother when she walked by. So I invented a character. I brought her up inside the apartment. So I named her Gentile Natan, and this scene starts with introducing her and also Rebecca's best friend, which we'll talk later about what I fictionalized. There was really a best friend, but I also made a bunch of stuff up. Okay. Halfway down the hill live two important people, Rahelika and Gentile Natan. Rebecca has always had a best friend, and it has always been Rahelika, who goes to school with her and to gymnastics and to the summer house in Büyükdere because their mothers are close friends, and Lika's father is a poorly paid teacher at an Alliance Israélite school, and they have no summer house. The two girls look alike, both dark-haired and petite. Strangers sometimes mistake them for twins, though Rebecca's eyes are lighter, and they tote around twin dolls, birthday gifts from Rebecca's father, Cherie and Bella, with blonde ringlets and beatific smiles. Rebecca stands out at school. They go to a Catholic school, French-speaking Catholic school. Rebecca stands out at school at drawing, painting, and singing, while Lika, on a scholarship to Sion, is gifted in math and science and would like to be a nurse. And I'm just going to jump a little, if that's okay, to get to Gentile Natan. Gentile Natan, Rebecca's father's first wife, lives upstairs from Lika, and Lika calls her Tia for aunt, though they're not related, as so Rebecca does too. Several times a week, Tia Gentile calls out the window or bangs on her floor, which is Lika's ceiling, and the girls know this means she has a task for them. When they come out to the street, she lowers money on a basket on a rope and sends them off to peddlers or shops, errands that Lika's mother says they must fulfill cheerfully because to be childless is a sorrow, and Tia worries about leaving her ancient mother on her own. Sometimes the girls make quick work of it and deliver the items into the basket. Other times, Tia Gentile says, "Come up for a visit, Misovinas. I've made you a cake." So dutifully at first, and then, with increasing desire, they climb the steep stairs to the dark apartment, and as her old mother snores on the couch, Tia Gentile offers them almond cakes and linden tea, or black coffee with sugar, which they gulp down fast, so she can read their fortunes in the muddy grounds. After the food is served, Tia Gentile says, you have to forgive my Ladino if any of you speak it, which you probably do, come con gana, is that right? Eat with desire, and she settles her tiny, oddly girlish body into a massive wooden chair and tells them stories of the kind that Rebecca's father loathes and her mother tolerates and Rebecca hungers for.
Thank you so much. So we will return to that passage to perhaps pull it apart narratively and in terms of its storyline. But Michael, I want to have you first insert your voice and the voice of your protagonist here. And I have invited you to start us with chapter 3.
Thank you, Sarah, and for having me, and Elizabeth for joining me up here, or letting me join her up here. It's how it feels a little bit. I love that passage. I sat down next to a woman in 2015 and started a conversation with her at a lecture in Greenwich Village, USA. And 6 years later, I wrote this book. She started to tell me the story of her life and didn't stop for all those years. And here's a little piece of that. I met with her on a series of Saturdays, and we spoke in Italian. Stella Levi, who is almost 102 now, was born into the Sephardic Jewish community of the island of Rhodes, which was at the time an Italian possession, and she grew up in a Judeo-Spanish / Ladino-speaking community that had its, I like to say, had 2 feet in the 19th century and 1 in the early 20th. She went to school in Italian. She spoke French, having learned it from her sisters and also at school. Her father spoke Turkish and Greek. Her mother spoke Turkish. Everyone spoke Hebrew. It was a mix of languages, personalities, centuries, and sensibilities. It took me a long time to wrap my head around what I just told you. We resume our places. The following Saturday, Stella in her armchair, I on the sofa next to a white porcelain lamp that is covered with 3-dimensional flowers and leaves. We exchange pleasantries, then for one moment and another, we sit in awkward silence. Aren't you supposed to ask me a question to get me going, like where I was born or my first memory or something like that? Those eyes of hers, suspicious yet provoking at the same time. Well, why don't you tell me when you first knew that you were different? What makes you think I was different? She asks, her eyes sparkling now. Stella was 14 by a month or 2. The notion came to her in the middle of the night. She had no idea how, possibly from watching her just older sister Renee turn 16 and begin to spend hours sitting in their living room. And their cortijo, the enclosed courtyard that was a feature of the better houses in the Judea, all of a sudden like an adult woman bent over her needlework at their mother's side, sewing, embroidering, preparing, that is, for the husband she'd not met and would never choose for herself. Nightgowns, handkerchiefs, table linen, sheets, pillowcases. Stella despised all this handiwork. She thought it was a ridiculous way for a girl to spend her time in preparing for this phantom man or a boy that someone, her mother, or someone else's mother, or an uncle, or a matchmaker, was going to pluck from the available candidates and present to her like a prize. She had another idea. Before going to bed at night, she found an old suitcase in the back of a closet. She brushed away a thin coating of dust and spread the suitcase out on the floor. She packed it diligently with clothes, shoes, empty notebooks, pens, a coat. She set it by the door, climbed in between her sheets, and went to sleep. In the morning, her mother found the suitcase and asked her if she was planning on going somewhere. Of course I am, she said to her, to university in Italy. That's Stella in a nutshell.
I love that.
Yeah.
So really these are 2 very different kinds of books in a variety of ways. But some of the ways that come to mind is that we have, Michael, in your book, a very intense dive into a one-person story that is also the story of a place and the devolution of that place and eventual evisceration of that place, which is the Jewish community of Rhodes. With Stella's character and rebellious streak and determination sort of transcending place. And it seems to me, Elizabeth, in your novel, family is the object around which story moves, rather than a single place. And in fact, the family moves through so many places and suffers the pains of migration and displacement, and sometimes of the loss of confidence and security that comes with the departure of a place. So I wondered if you could perhaps speak about the protagonists. Perhaps a protagonist is Rhodes as well as Stella, and perhaps a protagonist is family as well as Rebecca, and how you chose to center their stories. And I would say, almost as a footnote to that broad opening question, that it seems as if both of these books exerted themselves upon you. Stella, in a sense, sought your attention in the way that she sought the attention of the various men with whom she had long conversations and relationships in the course of her life. And your story, in some sense, asserts itself on you in the way that Gentile Nahon's storytelling asserts itself on Rebecca. Mm-hmm. So you are invited to
That's a
reply.
great question. You want to go first?
Sure. Should I go back to the mic?
Sure.
So, yeah, that was so perceptive, Sarah. It was a big puzzle to me. So as I was growing up with my grandmother, the question of where she was from was quite confusing to me, because it was very clear to me, so one side of my family is Ashkenazi and the other side is Sephardic, this side, and it was very clear to me that she was other and foreign, but she would sort of name all these different places because my family had a very strange migration. They actually moved, quote, back to Spain. She lived in Barcelona for a decade from the 1924 to 1934, and they didn't call Ladino or Judeo-Spanish, they called it Spanish, but it was also mixed with Spanish and Catalan because of where they lived. So I was always, and they would talk about Turkey with a certain amount of longing actually, but I was always confused about where she was from. And when I was 21, I interviewed her telling stories. So our books are really different, and yet there are some incredible parallels. And when I read Michael's, which I think I read it when mine was kind of in the pipeline to come out, and I had relied on some of Sarah's beautiful, beautiful scholarship, I was just sort of dazzled. I think I wrote to you. Did I?
You did.
I think I wrote
Thank you,
to
by
him.
the way.
And I was a little freaked out. I was like, oh, because there are some moments when we actually were, you can tell we researched in the same places. Like, I was like, I hope he doesn't think I'm copying him. Like, it's already been copy edited. I guess I interviewed her when I was 21, and I'm 60 now. This book took me almost a decade to write and get published. So there was this long lag. But one of my questions was, where are you from? And as I wrote the book and kind of imagined my way in, my grandmother died in 1992, so I was using other research and a lot of imagination and living family members to help me. I think family is some of it. I was really, really interested in when you have to move so much and leave so much behind, what you can take with you. And in her case, it was very complicated. She had several marriages, she had blended family, she was fiercely devoted to her family, but she was also somewhat like Stella, a very independent, passionate woman in some ways. And so there were other things that I felt like she took with her, like gardening and like music and performance, that are actually quite portable, right? Like those are not non-object things, and many of them had roots in Turkey and in her childhood, but she also would sing in Spanish and she would sing in French, and all of the incredible multilingualism and kind of cosmopolitanism that you describe was true of her too. So in a funny way, she was sort of this amalgam that wasn't very place-based, and her Judaism was also this kind of unquestioned center, and it took many different forms. But she was also, we were talking at lunch, you know, she went to Catholic school. When she lived in Florida in her retirement, she became friends with a reverend and would go to church with him. She was very, very fluid and very open. I was so moved by Al's speech, but that question of kind of seizing the moment and making things of wherever you are, I knew that about my grandmother, but as I wrote this and imagined my way in, it became even clearer because she lost a lot. Like family had been very wealthy. They'd lived for hundreds and hundreds of years in Turkey. I think it was their home. Their migration was different in that they weren't deported, right? It was due to exigencies and changes and mandatory military service and all kinds of things, but it wasn't the horror of the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. Although then they were in the Spanish Civil War, which is not where you think of maybe American Jews volunteering there, but you don't so much think of Jews who were actually living there. But, you know, my great-grandfather died in the bombing of Barcelona, so it's another piece of history.
Thank you.
I'm giving away a lot.
While we're continuing with the Mutual Admiration Society, I want to say that Elizabeth's book does something I wish I could have done, but this isn't really my story, which is that she was able to imagine herself into and fictionalize the life of her grandmother, and I think she had a certain freedom there that I'm envious of. Mm-hmm. I had to stick a little bit more closely to the facts, and also I'm a complete outsider to Sephardic culture. When I sat down that night in 2015, I knew very little about Sephardic Judaism, so this has been a journey of education and immersion for me. And I was saying at lunch, and I think, Elizabeth and I have talked about this before, sometimes being an outsider can be quite helpful because everything was new to me. I had to ask the most basic questions in order to try to see my way into Stella's story, which compelled me for reasons I didn't understand and maybe still don't wholly understand, except that I knew I was having an encounter with a human being and a moment in time that needed to be preserved. And so as much as place is so central to this book, I think time is actually other than Stella, the other protagonist, there's both the time of the mechanics of how the book came into being, which are these fairly patient Saturdays, more than 100, and some Tuesdays and Thursdays sometimes thrown in. And there was time in figuring out how to tell the story in a way that was appropriate for a story that wasn't mine, which required a lot of thinking and reflecting on how you frame the life of a person you have only met a few years ago, so to speak. And then, of course, there was time as it bore down so strongly on Stella's own life. Again, because she was the seventh born, the last born in a large family. She had her grandmothers alive when she was born. She lived in a community that, when she was born, barely had electricity and running water, just barely with the arrival of the Italians, where they used to take their meals and bread to be cooked in the communal oven, where they didn't bathe at home but went to the Turkish baths on Shabbat. She saw into these old habits, or the superstitions, the music, which is a great connective tissue, the food, the clothing, the thinking, was all very far-reaching backward, and yet she was born into a moment of modernity with the Italians coming to Rhodes, modernizing the physical plant of the city, but also opening up the horizons for a young woman like Stella, who was not going to sit there and embroider the darned bed sheets. She had ambitions. Those ambitions came because she had this collision with a modern culture that gave her a different view of her life. So hers is also, among other things, I think, the story of the formation of a young woman, the awakening to possibility, to ambition, to difference, and all of that, of course, is put to a severe test during the war years. So hers were not, they were very different kinds of migration, let's call them, in summary.
Interesting. Thank you. Those responses lead me to rearrange my thinking to ask you this. It seems as if, Elizabeth, you might have written yourself into Kantika. You might have written the writerly journey into Kantika. And Michael, you might have written yourself out of 100 Saturdays. So I'm curious about how you landed on that voice and that narrative decision. And it is perhaps only obliquely related to what I will tag on, but it's interesting to me that you both do not shy away from what Stella calls un frisson sensual, to a sexual, sensual, emotional intimacy. So as you comment on that choice to write in or to write out, I wonder if you could speak about that inclusion and why you thought it was essential in amplifying and elevating the story of a woman's coming to age.
You want to go first?
Sure. Working backwards from the frisson sensuel, you have a young adolescent woman, you just wonder what's going on with her on all levels. That is not an easy conversation for a man of a certain age and culture to have with a 100-year-old or 98-year-old woman, let's just say. But Stella was quite game, but she also drew the curtain on certain specifics, which of course I respect her for. Nevertheless, telegraphing what her life was about. She was very interested in men. She made friendships with men. They were all very different men. These men opened up aspects of her life that surely would not have opened up otherwise. And that's my answer to that question. But it pervades her life, as it does most human lives. As for writing myself in or out of the story, this was a real dilemma because, again, as I tried to think about I'm not a biographer and I'm not a historian, and this is not an oral history, this book. This book really, as I eventually came to think of it, is an encounter between two different storytellers. I've said this before, but I see it all the more clearly with the passage of time, is that I had to find my own way into the story, and the only way I could do that was by using my craft of storytelling to meet up with Stella's inborn natural storytelling and see where we could go with it. That's as present as I needed to be, except that, of course, I become a character because I'm her interlocutor. And so I will ask stupid questions and she will call me out for them. I will make mistakes and she will correct them. We often disagreed, actually, and we grew to care deeply for each other. So the hues and colors of our relationship come through, but without being in any way the foreground of the subject at hand.
Yeah, and interestingly, I mean, I actually found that one of the sort of unexpected, incredibly moving things about your book, that you do feel this sort of patience and this kind of, and sometimes she says no, doesn't let you in. So that dynamic was really interesting. I guess I'll do that part of it first. I did have, when the book went out to editors, there were these little interstitial chunks that was a granddaughter interviewing a grandmother with a tape recorder, kind of. And my editor, and I was ambivalent about them, but I was sort of playing. I found the structure really hard to figure out. And my editor said, you don't need it, you were everywhere in this book. Like, you are laced through every moment, and we don't need a tape recorder. So, I mean, it's a much bigger question in a way. Really, it's sort of, why did I write it as fiction, right? And why did I stop in 1950? Because I wasn't born till 1964, right here in Los Angeles. I stayed for 3 weeks. I'm back home now. I was very interested in, as a novelist, in inner life and in, I don't quite know, in sort of being the I, but not the I. Even though I did have tremendous adventures researching this book, and I was tempted to write about them, and I have a little video on my website that's got clips of my grandmother's voice and some stuff about the backstory. So it was all really, really fascinating, but I didn't feel like it was my story. I think I had a feeling with my grandmother of her, maybe similar to you, of her never having been able to tell her story. Like, she would say, nobody knows what I've been through. Nobody knows. And yet she was a real talker. And so this can segue to the frisson. She was incredibly open with me. Since I was very young, very, very different from my other grandmother. It was clear that she and my grandfather had a passionate relationship. She would talk about bodies. She viewed herself as a kind of healer, which I think is common in Sephardic families, that maybe one person per generation. And she was extraordinarily open. So in the little video that's on my website, she says at the end of it, I'll tell you the whole story. You're not a child. You can understand. And she didn't tell me the whole story. I only have 2 hours of tape. She would have told me more if I had known I was going to write a novel. I mean, we didn't sit for that long, but she was really open. And so I did, as I was writing it, this same editor who told me to get rid of the tape recordings at my first reading from the book, which was at the Astoria bookshop in Queens, because part of the book is set in Astoria, raises her hand, and my daughter's in the audience and lots of my family, and she says, how did you write so well about your grandparents having sex? And I was like, Reva, no, it's a novel, But I mean, I guess I feel kind of like what Michael said, if you're writing about full lives, that's part of it, but I also did feel a kind of permission from her in that she was, I don't want to stereotype sort of what a grandmother-granddaughter relationship is like, but she was an unusually embodied person. Here's a slightly graphic example, but when my mother told her when I was like 13 that I had started menstruating for the first time, she sent me, this is a little weird, bloody cheesecloth with flower petals in it, in an envelope. And as a kid, I was just like, whoa, this is disgusting. Like, what is this? And I don't know, have you ever heard of that? Is this some Sephardic custom, or is this just my weird grandma? I have no idea. But it was a sort of blessing. It was a kind of like, this is, you are becoming a woman, and I am welcoming you. And it was very odd from my perspective.
Clearly.
But that just gives you a glimpse. Like, there was a lot of that. So I sort of felt like I could venture to these places.
Wonderful, thanks. Well, following this thread forward a little bit, it struck me as interesting that Michael, this is perhaps a version of my last question, but Michael, you are writing, you are seeking to tell a story with fidelity, even though through a conversation. And you or your editors or the publishers still make the choice to have this beautiful artwork by Myra Coleman illustrate it, which gives it a dreamy, extra historical content in a way.
Right.
And conversely, Elizabeth, you're fictionalizing a story that is born of your family story, and yet you make the opposite choice, which is to have photographs.
Yeah.
Your own family photographs illustrate that fictionalized version. So there's this interesting interplay between nonfiction, fiction, and it comes through, I think, in interesting ways around voice. I mean, Michael, it strikes me that this book has, I mean, I'd be curious if you disagree, but a somewhat steady voice of your other works. I'm not talking about topic, but
yes, of course.
narratively.
Of course, because it's, shall I answer this?
Yeah, well, I'll just say,
Sorry,
and then I'll
finish,
turn to you. But Elizabeth, it struck me that yours was a very different voice, a dreamier voice. And you said in an interview, I think, with Moment Magazine, that you found yourself being lured into a kind of dream fugue. So, Michael.
Well, this will sound very contradictory for as much as I was invested and am invested in telling the story with fidelity to it, as well as I could, to the factual experience that Stella related to me. Our conversations happened in Italian, but even if they'd happened in English, for me to sit down and write her again, this is not a transcript of our interviews, this is not a work of strict biography, which itself is, of course, open to all kinds of interpretation, but it becomes a retelling of my experience. So it's a recapturing of the experience of Stella. She therefore becomes, to a degree, an invention of the author. And I don't think that's a bad thing. She's still alive. She can still tell her story. She has contradicted me. She has supported me. She corrected me. I read her the entire book, page by page over a period of several months, which was a very helpful experience, because she would pipe up and say, "That's so boring," even though some story she told me, or "You've got that wrong," or speaking of the aspect sensual, that she would add certain details, take out certain details. But she's still a creation of the author. How could she not be, ultimately? And therefore, and the other thing, I did feel quite a great responsibility following the fidelity in general to Stella's life, but also to the place and to that community, because it was so violently erased. Because it will never exist again, like so many communities, because she was still that eyewitness whose eyes I could look into and maybe have a glimpse of what that world was. And I knew what my limitations were also. I mean, it's a very humbling experience to talk to someone and try to hear their story, because there are so many things you don't think to ask. You don't think to say, was there a clock on the wall? Or were there cats in the courtyard? Or where did you do your homework? Because you don't know what you don't know because you didn't look at it. And so one thing that I particularly stuck with me was that it was clearly a very vibrant setting. It's a Mediterranean country. Island, I call it to myself, the Malibu of the Mediterranean. They were beach bums. They had these rich, fragrant gardens. They ate citrus. I could relate to all of it because it felt LA-like in a certain sense. But I could tell you that there was a pot of red geraniums in the courtyard, but there's nothing like having someone with the palate and imagination of her own, like Myra, apply her own sensibility to what she was able to see, mostly through historical photographs, not all Stella's, and to kind of give it that color and that energy and an almost visual musicality, if you will, to open the book even more to us and try to lure us in even more deeply to this forgotten, or not forgotten, but this disappeared world.
And it's certainly a third conversation.
Absolutely, it's yet another conversation. And just to say, although I love the way that, in the sort of Zibaldian way that Elizabeth drops photographs into her fiction, I felt that photographs in this book would have been too concrete and too literalizing. And also because the photographic record of Stella, who was deported to Auschwitz, she was not packing the family photo album with her, is of course very spotty. There are pictures of her when she's 2, or an infant, and then 2, and then 4, and then 12, because they were the photographs that were sent to the family members and friends who'd already left the community. And so there's no completeness to it. There's no curatorial intention to them. The choices are limited, and I didn't think they themselves could contribute as much as maybe the illustrations could.
And before we turn it to Elizabeth, do you have a comment on this theme of voice and constancy of voice or not?
I avoided that one. You noticed
I
that,
did.
yes.
I'm going to push.
Yes.
Okay.
How about that? Yes,
Okay.
there is a consistency of voice.
So yeah, I think it's fascinating that the illustrations in Michael's book kind of tug it towards story, almost children's. You know, they're whimsical and lush and beautiful. And mine, which does have, as Sarah said, you know, at the front of every chapter, a photograph, tugs it towards nonfiction. So a lot of it, of the kind of dance of figuring out this book for me, was a kind of tension between both wanting to show the seams and that there's something real out there, and wanting to have a kind of, and this maybe gets to voice, cast a spell where you're just flying through and you're not thinking about what's real and not. I mean, if I were to say highlight, like everything I got from Sarah's work, or everything I got from my Uncle David, or the book would be kind of like this crazy mass of colors of different seams, and I didn't want that. I wanted the reader to kind of be taken inside. So I think in terms of voice, music was also really important to me, and I've always been a very voice-driven writer. Like, I'll sort of end sentences on a beat, because sometimes I have to work to not privilege sound over sense. Like, I'll have such a strong desire to kind of get a cadence. But, you know, Kantika means song in Ladino, and my grandmother sang a lot, and I actually love to think of this book as a kind of song or a duet or a polyphonic voice piece. But I also, so in that way, I wanted it to be seamless. I wanted you to just be in the story, moving between characters. But I was also really, really interested in signaling that there were real people out there for a couple reasons. One was super personal, like, it's my family, right? And a lot of them, some of them are still alive. And but partly it also gets to this question of who my grandmother was and what you can bring with you, and the kind of terribleness of photos being lost. In her case, she saved a bunch of stuff. And I know you've done work on this, but they are completely fascinating. Like, I could look at the back and be like, oh, this photo, this first one in the book, was taken by an Armenian photographer on Rue Pera in this era. Like, I would go down these rabbit holes of research, and then I'm like, I'll take him to the studio, and it's all so loaded. You know, the Armenian genocide is soon to come. Like, there's so much history. So I was interested in how the photos were things that she carried with her. I was very interested also in time. Now we have social media then, and, you know, WhatsApp, and then when you migrated, it was all you had. Like, you know, you had to wait, or you're lucky if you had a photograph. So I was really interested in them as these sort of loaded objects, and also as sort of transactional objects, you know, a wedding picture, and objects that might lie, objects. My grandmother was really into fashion. She was a dressmaker. She was a shapeshifter who looks like a kind of Turkish folkloric, you know, dancer in one photo and like a French lady in the next. So I was interested in them in terms of how she could present herself. And then I guess just quickly, the last thing is I was interested in quietly, implicitly kind of inviting readers to think about their own archives if they exist, or the absence of them if they don't, and kind of, how do they speak? How can you read them? What's outside the frame? You know, I love it when people say, oh, you made me start to look back and write from my own family photos.
Thanks.
Can I ask a quick question? Did anyone criticize you for using photos of real people in a fictional setting?
Yes.
Like that?
So when the book was sent out, I had a couple offers from editors, and one editor said, I love this novel, but I won't publish it with the photos. In fact, she even said to my literary agent, I can't read it with the photos. Can she send me another copy? I was like, that's very sensitive of you. But I think she felt that it disrupted the, you know, it does mess with genre. Of course, there's lots of examples.
Right.
Sebald being one of, there's a lot of people doing this, but it does worry the boundary. And I think I understood it in some ways. She was like, I don't want you to tell me what to picture. You know, that there can be a kind of intimacy when you're reading fiction of picturing
yourself.
it for yourself. So
Right. Okay. So I was surprised to come across, I mean, in both books, this was a bit of a fleeting detail, but both of you describe women who, in moments of unease, gather the dew in the morning in a vessel to then transmutate it into a blessing. I don't have the page number, so I'm hoping you remember where this was. And it struck me as such a fascinating testimony to relationship to place and to abiding spirituality and to women's practices of not so much canonical religion as sort of para-religious practices. So I'd be curious where, and you're both very good researchers, where you, why you held on to this motif. And I want to wed it to something that seems a disjuncture, which is a story of loss. Because on the one hand, you have these women gathering the last remains of the water of the sky, right? Mm-hmm. To transport it into something curative. And at the same time, you have women suffering tremendous loss. And the loss is irrevocable, Michael, in your case, the destruction of the community of Rhodes. And Elizabeth, in your case, the origin community isn't destroyed, which is Istanbul, but it is depleted through emigration. Yeah. And for the individuals who leave, that leaving is marked by so much loss. And the way you write about, maybe we could have you read the section about the plants being replanted, loss pervades, especially for the father figure, pervades that transition. So I wonder then, if I could invite you to talk about that tension between grabbing hold of place, grabbing hold of the most ephemeral aspect of place, the morning dew, and then losing, and what losing and loss and displacement meant for your protagonists.
Well, it's interesting. You were framing it in a way I haven't thought of it before. It was Stella's grandmother who was the healer in her community, and a quite famous one in context. And I think that, so it wasn't Stella firsthand in performing these practices, but certainly being highly attentive to them and being very central to her storytelling was to convey them to me. And I think, again, I said earlier that time was really one of the major characters in the book, and I don't think you arrive at 95 when I first met her, 102 now, without thinking a lot about the arc of time in your own life. And I think that the more she's aged, the more Stella has looked back at the rarity and importance of some of the vestigial traces of that world that she was able to live firsthand. Like the famous Encerradura, which is maybe even a more vivid example for Stella in particular, which was a practice in the community performed by women like, and in fact her own grandmother, when they would put to bed a young woman who had suffered some kind of psychological crisis, and it was always the women for some reason, and put her to bed for an entire week, empty out the houses on either side of her, sit there, feed her vegetable broth, and pray, holding mumie, which were I have to say, purported ashes of dead Jewish saints, because I just received this vitriolic letter, from the man saying there's no such thing as a dead Jewish saint with ashes,
or sometimes circumcised skin.
Or circumcised foreskin.
Was.
Some powdery flesh from the mother country, meaning the Holy Land. And prayers and prayers and prayers, and then a week later, lo and behold, she's reborn, she's better, she goes to Turkish baths and gets back in the saddle and starts embroidering for her eventual marriage. So I think that it is about loss in the sense that Stella, even in her own conscious youth, her age, conscious of her consciousness in her youth, saw that these were very peculiar habits that were not long for this world. And I think she takes a lot of pride, as I would too, in passing them on as relics of the longevity.
But she scolds you when you dismiss them.
When I say, this didn't really happen, because part of my character in the book is to be that skeptic, mm-hmm. and oh yeah, she really raps me on the knuckles for that one, because in fact she did see it happen several times. Yeah, it's quite remarkable when you think of it. Other things like pinning the roux, which is something that then when I read your piece, it was, thank goodness, and she didn't make that one up because Sarah says, Professor Stein says that it really happened. They would pin roux to their underclothing to keep them safe, I think it was.
Yes,
It was
protector.
Protector. And it goes on and on. It has to do with the food, the proverbs, it's endless. Yeah.
So maybe we'll come back to Stella and loss in a moment and read a section of from
As
that,
you
but
wish.
let you respond first.
Sure. I mean, there's so many echoes. I think I was really drawn. First of all, I didn't know a lot of these. My grandmother had a lot of rituals and a lot of, quote, superstitions and a very, as I said, fluid sense of both religion and belief / superstition. I hesitate even to separate them out that much because I think they all were working in very interrelated and kind of, deserving of respect ways. Like, you kind of, the women's, quote, superstitions often get relegated, but she had a lot going on. I think I read about the dew. I was trying to find the Rosemary and Jack Levy. There's a book about Sephardic rituals and superstitions. But I guess I was really interested.
Rebecca Levy Amato.
Okay, that's right.
Yeah,
Stella's cousin.
Oh, okay.
That's one of them, yeah.
I was really interested, so some of it came from what I knew of her, but I was also just really interested in what I read about kind of life in Istanbul, in their neighborhood, and I see a lot of strong echoes in your book, in the period before everything fell apart for them. There was this incredible kind of communal and often kind of matriarchal set of practices, and many of them were around things like illness and healing and death. So things like sewing, they would get together to sew shrouds, which I found incredibly moving. So all of these ways of dealing with massive life passages, but they were communal. There were open doors. They would you were around all your relatives. And then my grandmother's family was just absolutely flung into diaspora. So she ended up in the United States with one sister. I still have relatives in Spain. Some of her brothers moved to Israel. And so they had none of that anymore. And they didn't even live in a Sephardic community in New York for complicated reasons. My grandfather was from bringing in social class, really. He was from a much lower social class, and his family was there, and she didn't want to live with them, but she also wanted a garden. But she brought a lot of these things with her, and so I guess, and yet I think they both kept their potency and were really depleted because they weren't communal in the same way. And so that the poignancy of that kind of, you still do these things. And my mother tells me that she would I would be coughing as a baby, and my mother would turn her back, and my grandmother would have dribbled something down my throat. And my mother would be like, what? And then I'd get better. I mean, she was really, really good. She actually really knew what she was doing. And she was, again, very flexible. So they lived in a neighborhood in Cambria Heights, Queens, eventually, where her neighbor was Cuban, and she'd sing songs with him, and they had the sisterhood at their little storefront synagogue, and they were almost all Ashkenazi families, but she would do theater with them. So it was a remaking and holding on, but also a tremendous loss. And so she was this really intense mix, even in my interactions with her, and I hope this comes across in the novel, of robust and solid and shape-shifting, and then with this kind of grief, this kind of heaviness that didn't come out that often, but that you would feel. And I viewed it as, in a way, especially as I began to imagine a character, the loss of that really interdependent, embedded community.
Before we open it up for questions and comments, I'd like to just end with two more readings, if you would. Elizabeth, can you start us, just because it follows so neatly from what you just said, on page 89, set the scene for us about the replanting of bulbs and cuttings from the garden at home?
Sure. So my book, actually, I've been focusing so much on Rebecca, but it moves points of view. So there's a character inspired by my great-grandfather Alberto. I never met him. My mother never met him. He's the one who died in Barcelona. But my uncles David and Albert, who helped me a lot with this book, but sadly died before it came out, but were with me much along the way, did know him. So he was a gardener, and I discovered various photos and an old film and things, and gardening is something that's really been passed down. So my mother's a gardener, my sister and I garden, my grandmother did. I have rue in my garden that I planted after reading your essay. And so I was really interested in that. So this is just a little scene where Alberto has brought bulbs and seeds from Turkey, and they're in Barcelona, and he has not weathered the migration well. His wife is much more robust. He's 25 years older than she is. He's old, he's tired, he's worried about what's happening in both Spain and Europe. So he's got his eye on the horizon in a way that turns out to be quite accurate, but his wife and daughter think he's just paranoid at this point. So this is a scene where Sultana, which is the real name of my great-grandmother, who I also never met, where am I going to start? Hold on a sec. Has taken all of his bulbs and dumped them in the corner of the garden, and then he comes out. It is El Dio who leads them, they agree on this later. It is El Dio who shows Alberto his wife, rain-washed, drained of tears, unafraid. You, he flings back, and she nods, and he shocks her by coming to her ready to strike. On rare occasions, he will take the switch to the boys, but he has never raised a hand to her or their daughters. But he stops suddenly and drops his arm down, and whatever is to happen will now happen. She is that calm, that far away. She moves forward in silence, not toward her husband, but toward the far corner of the garden where she dumped the bulbs, roots, and seeds. The garden has always been Alberto's world, but how hard can it be to untangle the roots, lay the bulbs out in a row on the nearby patio stones, turn toward the garden bed, fill her fists with weeds, and tug? The soil, damp on the surface but dry below, yields easily as she pulls two-fisted, dropping the weeds in a pile at her side, and then he is there beside her. They are on their knees, removing dead growth, making room for the new, and he is correcting her, but mildly, as if nothing unusual has just transpired between them. Leave that one. It's not a weed. Take those out. Here, that's it. And he's shuffling off to the shed again against the courtyard's back wall and comes back with a pitchfork, rusty shovel, spade. Some of the bulbs are desiccated and unfit for planting. These he sets to one side. Others are solid to the touch or sprout, pale green shoots, color of endives. These he plants. Though the suitcase had seemed full when Sultana emptied it, in truth it's no more than an overnight bag and held just enough bulbs for a few square feet of jonquils, tulips, or hyacinths, along with several envelopes embossed with the names of the textile factory full of seeds. Alberto lays down newspaper on the low stone wall and spreads seeds out to dry on yesterday's news, while Sultana deposits the weeds in a spot he points out between the shed and wall. It is El Dio who keeps her from saying that a valise, even a ruined one, is good for one thing only, to be filled with clothes. And El Dio who prevents her from calling out that she's had enough. She'll find her way to Corinne, her daughter, in Cuba, or to her mother back home. Take Joseph with her, because he's too young to be left with a father who is ready to throttle him without proof of wrongdoing and promises to tutor him, but never does. Adieu.
Thank you. I find that such a beautiful commentary on the agony of displacement and also the resilience of the transplant. Michael, if we could turn to some of Stella's memories of deportation, and I was thinking of page 139, and one of the things that I found so remarkable on rereading this book was that she was so worldly as a young woman growing up on Rhodes. She, the speaker of multiple languages, befriends Italian generals, even German military representatives on her island. a voracious reader, a free spirit, an energetic socializer. And the first time she leaves Rhodes is in the course of deportation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I thought that was such a powerful testimony to the richness of life on an island, the richness of life in a small community, and also the vulnerability.
And the limited horizons at the same time,
Yeah.
I think. Only one young woman had left, as far as we know, to attend the Sorbonne, where she then came back as a teacher. So it wasn't like there were a lot of examples of adventuresome people for her to model herself on.
So
what did you want me to read?
If you could perhaps set the stage for what happens
Sure.
on 139 and choose.
Sure. Oh, you're going for the jugular here,
Yes,
I
I
see.
am.
Okay, so yes, probably should say that in July of 1944, the entire community of around 1,700 or so people of the Jewish community of Rhodes was deported to Auschwitz. These people were never ghettoized. They did not wear yellow armbands. They conducted life more or less normally within the parameters of having been, of course, stripped of their civil rights under the racial laws of Italy of 1938. But because they were so far away, things sort of fell, some of the strictness loosened, and they were able to continue living, working, going to the beach. Of course, in wartime, and so not exactly having, a carefree life, but not what we think of happening in those years necessarily. When all of a sudden, in July of 44, the order comes from Athens to round up these Jews too, and take them on what was the longest deportation measured either by time, 3 weeks plus, or geography, practically Turkey to Athens to Auschwitz. And indeed, it was the first time Stella left the island. Here, Sarah has us now in the camps. I do want to say one other thing, actually, that something I've only learned really, or begun to think about with more distance. The women's experience in the camps was, and this has been written about, but I don't know if any of you know, there's a New Life of Anne Frank out, and the author, Ruth Franklin, speaks very directly to the different experience of women in the camps, women who stuck together, who formed sub-communities, who forwent food in order to save it up to buy one of their, the members of their group, friends and relatives. In Stella's case, she stuck together with 5 young women, among them her sister and her cousin, so that they could buy a sweater, so they could improve their quality of life. They would comb each other's hair. They tried to remain human. I'm not saying that men didn't, but there's a very particular connectivity among the women. And the other thing they did, of course, was try to find everyone. And that's what's happening here. They start singing because they brought music with them to the camp, something else we don't think about. They used to sing at night to comfort themselves, to entertain themselves, to reconnect with they hoped, their family members, and sang in Judeo-Spanish. And then Stella's thinking is, surely if their mothers heard this song, their mothers or their fathers or their aunts or uncles, someone from home, anyone from home, they would have responded with a line, a melody, even just a word. But no one did. No one sang back. No sounds came back. And that, Stella says, is where we began to know that they weren't there. Began to know because it didn't happen all at once. Because they didn't understand all at once. Because no one came to inform them that their parents, their aunts and uncles, the parents and aunts and uncles of their friends had all been murdered. Was there never a precise moment? Was there never a precise moment, I asked Stella, when you understood, definitively understood? That is a question from this world, Michael, not that world. Not only was there never a moment I can pinpoint when I understood, there was never a moment, not for a very long time, when I allowed myself, when any of us allowed ourselves to feel. We were too busy trying to survive, she pauses, but it was there, of course, everywhere all the time. The knowledge. It was like a flame, too ferocious to come near. If we touched it, we ourselves might die.
Thank you.
On that note.
On that note. Well, I want to leave time for conversation, questions from those who've gathered. I wonder, before we do that, would either of you like to ask the other something?
We could probably go on for hours, but I would ask you, Elizabeth, how writing this book has changed the way you think about your practice generally. Are you going to go further into family stories and continue to make them all up again, or are you going to go more toward the factual? Are you going to leave the Sephardim? What's happening next?
So I'm actually playing with a nonfiction book now, which is interesting because I feel like it's been a sort of slow move towards it. And your question about kind of where are you in here, and I'm kind of like I'm everywhere, but I also am conveniently nowhere, right? And I have always found fiction, one of the things I love about fiction is I feel like it has allowed me to go really deep into intense places without revealing myself overtly. There's something kind of at a slant. You know that Emily Dickinson line, tell all the truth but tell it slant. So I do feel increasingly, I turned 60 this year, like I don't know, who cares? I just want to try new things. I mean, I've always felt that with books. But so I think partly writing this did get me, I've also always done lots of research, but it did get me closer and closer to my own family. So I've written a whole bunch of books about other things. This is also the first really Jewish book I've written, and I had a feeling as I was I have Jewish characters in my other books, but it's not central for a lot of complicated reasons, I think. But I wasn't raised in a practicing family at all. I was raised culturally Jewish in an area with almost no Jews. But so I'm playing with nonfiction, and I'm playing with my father's side of the family, which isn't Sephardic at all. But I'm interested kind of in I will be a character in it, and I'm essentially writing about my father, and his past, and I'm discovering all kinds of really interesting things, but I'm finding it really hard. I mean, you've written Memoir, and your book, The Mighty Franks, actually was super helpful to me, but this question of kind of where does the self come in? How do you structure it? Real life is tremendously complicated. There's all these detours. And then there's all these people who can have reactions. So I think the fact that this book ended in 1950 was kind of a little bit of a way out for me. So I'm getting bolder. I kind of think, why not? Time is short.
You have to pretend they're all dead anyway, otherwise you won't be able to write.
Yeah, I know. It's scary though. We're going to have coffee afterwards, and I need help. Can I ask you the same question, which is, you've now written fiction, a sort of biography that you're in, and a memoir about your family, and so you're actually very multi-genre-y.
Well, I like each one to be a bit of a surprise, but telling Stella's story has certainly made me want to go back to some of my family stories from much earlier than I've written about before.
You told me the once that you wished you talked to your grandmother more, I remember.
And so now I'm talking to her and some other people of her generation, the generation before, except they're all dead, and so the conversation is through papers, letters, photographs, my mother, interviews, and I don't know what sort of book it will be. It will be somewhere between real and unreal, imagined and factual, and kind of blend together everything I've done so far. But I took a lot of inspiration from the freedom you allowed yourself with Kantika to take what is real and imagine it, and so I'm somewhere in that territory.
Thank you. So let me open the floor, and if there are a lot of hands, we might take 2 at once or 3 at once and see, but the floor is open. Please.
Elizabeth, you're talking about people having all kinds of superstition is to me equal to religion. It reminds me of how superstitious the conversation was around Turkish coffee and bizcocho and superstition. It came in all kinds of ways into the conversation. And I'm thinking of Sarah going for an interview for a professorship, and
This is my mother.
Oh, this is Sarah. Oh, okay. Lovely to meet you.
She wore a charm under her blouse
My little
so that she would
I've
have
got
good
one in my
luck.
purse.
Did it work? Did it work?
Seems to have.
Was it whether it's job?
No, it
Just
wasn't.
to tell you that it is not disappearing. It's still as powerful sort of as religion. And I became aware of that when you spoke about it. And I'm sure you heard about superstition and Rome.
Non-stop, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Right. So I really thank both of you for explaining that to me, how important superstition is in the culture.
I mean, it's very interesting because before I even knew much, I'm a very superstitious person. I mean, you can also call it like OCD, right? Like,
Yeah, right.
depending on how you want to look at it. I don't think it's necessarily like, you know, it's adaptive, but it's also, for me anyway, a little bit of a kind of little stutter in my head. Like, I knock on wood too much. And so, you know, where does that come from? Is that because I have a Sephardic grandmother? I don't know, but I do think that that it was kind of accepted and made sort of normalized in that society in a way that I actually kind of appreciate, instead of it just being like some weird or pathologized thing, you know.
Well, if I can add, I mean, I think the other thing is both of you are elevating female protagonists.
Yeah.
And if you elevate female protagonists, you must look in domains that traditional lenses on cultures were not willing to look. Superstition being one, sensuality being another. I think friendship is so important here, which we didn't talk about.
Yeah.
And which is why I brought up the insight from Ruth Franklin in the New Anne Frank biography. I only understood this too later as I began talking more about Stella's story, is that they brought their close relationships from the close neighborhood where generationally everyone had been involved, perhaps suffocatingly for the younger people in each other's lives, but they knew how to do that. It was modeled for them, and they lived it themselves, and they continued it in the camps, it just makes so much sense. But they knew how to bond. They were very closely, and they were already a bonded small community, outsiders, though well integrated, but in a wider culture, and they bring that is transportable too. You know, it's one of those I'm just thinking of that now. It's one of those things you can take with you.
Any other questions or comments? Please, Jeff.
So with that, a specific question for you about when you were thinking about writing your book, did you ever consider writing as a nonfiction?
I did, yeah, early on. More than any of my previous books, certainly, because I had a lot of material, but I think I was quickly, and because it was so personal, I think I quickly came up against two things. One, I didn't have enough material. Like, if my grandmother had been alive when I did it, maybe I would have written it in that way. And it would have been really fun and fascinating, because I actually think she would have been a very willing participant, but she wasn't. And then I wanted to be able to go behind closed doors and inside people's inner lives in a way that you just can't do as easily in nonfiction unless you kind of say I mean, there are books, like there's a book called The Woman Warrior by Maxine Hung Kingston that I love, that was published both as fiction and nonfiction, where she sort of signals that she's flipping in and you're totally in scene, but it's a hybrid book again. So yes, I kept being drawn to the borders, and then somehow fiction kept winning, and yet with photos and some real names. So I felt like I was trying to have it both ways. I didn't want to have to keep saying, this is where she stopped Sarah, maybe they went here. I didn't want to have to keep kind of conjecturing in a way that I felt to be accurate I would have had to. And I also did want to be able to go inside people's heads.
And bodies.
And bodies, just as importantly, yeah.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both for your conversation and for your books, and wish you well on future projects. And for those in the audience, we have books for sale somewhere, I think by the door. And I encourage you both to buy both of these wonderful works and seek the author's signature. So thank you for joining us. To the Finci family and Viterbi family, thank you for making this possible. And we look forward to future books and future conversation together.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us. So much fun.